the dogs out. Yes, you let the dogs out because you will be getting on that druid and leveling as a werewolf ASAP. Everybody and their mom is basically playing a werebear or a storm or a earth leveling druid, but you don't want to do that because wolves and dogs and werewolves. This is essentially a leveling build to take you to as close to 50 as possible, going through the skills that are probably best for you to take as you level through the game and want to make sure that you put that werewolf to action. Now, this might not be the best build to play out there. I have tested werewolf, werebear, and spellcasting druid, and werewolf is a little bit gear dependent and probably one of the slower ones early on. I would not recommend it if you want to speed level unless you get lucky with some legendaries, but that's usually later on into the game. However, this is not about the fastest way to level, this is about the coolest way to level, and you can indeed level as a werewolf. You will actually have damage, and it is actually really cool. It's a unique playstyle that you will use, especially by using companions as well. You might have seen similar builds online as well, but this is my take that I've been able to test as well with the leveling skill, and depending on if you want to go through a story route, if this is an alt or anything like that, it kind of depends. Since I've leveled it as a main, I will probably talk about it from the main perspective. But what you can expect from the werewolf is that you'll be fast-paced, you'll have a lot of mobility, and woof. With that being said, let's get into the skill part. Now, in terms of skills, I will be assuming you do 0 renown action, which is practically impossible, meaning that you don't have any additional skill points from the renown board. But if this is your alt, or if this is something that you use to farm side quests, farm dungeons, farm strongholds, and all of that, you'll have points faster than actually leveling. But keep that in mind, when I mention a particular level, breakpoint is usually referring to as if you leveled without actually getting any extra points whatsoever. Your first point that you will put at level 2 will be into Claw as your main spirit generator. It is the werewolf generator ability. It does okay single target damage. With enhanced Claw, you'll have a little bit of extra attack speed, meaning that you can essentially do more and more claws. And after this, get 1 point into Shred, which is basically your core ability, your main source, and your majority source of damage throughout this entire playstyle. Enhanced Shred is obvious, you're gonna get it because it's also a prerequisite. It also gives you sustain, but it's a prerequisite to Primal Shred, which is what I would recommend you take, mostly because of its utility. First of all, it adds mobility. Obviously, Shred is a 3 combo ability, and you don't have to spend them back to back. You can shred once, do a claw or whatever, and then shred again. And each time you shred, you can leap to your target. You can use it to move around the battle, kind of swapping target and target. And then with the last one, obviously, you'll do a lot of damage as well in AoE. Not to mention that Raging Shred's poison damage is a little bit weak earlier on. It can get better later on, and poison is a big part of this build, so you can always come back to this and swap them around if you so desire. If you don't need the mobility and you just want the poison uptime, you can definitely take Raging Shred instead. After this, you'll put 1 point into Wild Claw, where you will probably be level 7. Wild Claw gives you a chance for more single target damage on bosses, which is very ideal because that's usually the weakness of Shapeshifting Druid, and more chance for Spirit Generation because it, has a chance to proc multiple times. And once again, the alternative Fierce Claw poison is pretty meh in terms of damage, so I wouldn't recommend it, at least not early on. After this, you'll put 1 point into Blood Howl, which is your defensive skill of choice. With Enhanced Blood Howl and Innate Blood Howl, we will get a lot of healing and a lot of spirit, because that's pretty much important. Since the attack speed alternative is not that great early on, you don't really have a lot of melee damage, where attack speed would probably benefit. It might be better later on, but the 20 spirit is just way superior because it is equivalent to 2 baseline claws, and you will essentially get a lot of resets because obviously you're going to kill a lot of stuff, so you'll use this quite a bit. And after this, you'll put 2 points into Shred, getting you all the way up to level 12. You'll now max Shred yet because your next point will be into Poison Creeper. Now, this is probably one of the strongest abilities that you have right now for Druid, unless some other tuning happens. Obviously, the damage is amazing. You want it for the damage. You also want it for the root, which is pretty good. Helps you with your survivability, especially when you start to get surrounded, since Werewolf is a little bit squishier, definitely way squishier than Werebear. Enhanced Poison Creeper is a prerequisite to obviously Brutal Poison Creeper, which is what you really want because crits are good for werewolf synergies. Not to mention that Ferocious Poison Creeper is possibly a DPS loss since it extends the poison. It doesn't add more poison. However, once you get to a point where you want targets to be poisoned for a lot longer because poison synergies, then maybe it is useful to get Ferocious Poison Creeper instead of Brutal Poison Creeper. And after you get all of this, you will put your last 2 points into Shred, getting you up to level 17 with a maxed out ideal Shred. You will put your first point into Wolves at your next level up, and Enhanced Wolf Pack, which you will notice is where your poison starts to become really important. Sure, you can add CCs and stuff, but poison is more reliable and it will give you damage on your wolves. Brutal Wolf Pack is your choice here to fully finish up the wolf synergy, and at this point you want to really start prioritizing crit chance so that once you crit you'll always get more damage from the wolves. After this, you will put 1 point into Neurotoxin to essentially add slow to your poison. It's not a lot, but it is a little bit, but mostly you want this because of Toxic Claws. First of all, 1 point as of now in Toxic Claws, making your crits apply poison as well. Once again, we don't really, obviously damage is good, but we don't really care about the damage now, but applying poison to the targets essentially adds to the poison synergy. And after that, you'll put 2 points into Envenom. This is definitely what you want because poison enemies will take additional crit damage since you will want to crit a lot. And when you crit on poison enemies, you'll just do a lot of damage. Once again, poison enables stuff. It doesn't really do that much poison. And unless the poison gets buffed overall, or you get a lot of gear with a lot of poison damage, if you're really lucky, then maybe poison will become relevant. With the 2 points in Envenom, you'll also be level 24, and at this point you will make a choice, because right now your skill bar will fill with the next choice that you make. You won't have enough space for all of the skills, so you can either get Rabies, which is something that you will get if you want AoE focused damage, basically clearing packs of monsters, dungeons and things like that, or you can take Lacerate if you need more single target damage, good for bosses and things like that. You cannot have both because there's not enough space and you would have to sacrifice something else. I think you don't really need both at the same time, so you would have to sacrifice like a companion or whatever. So pick whatever you want for whatever content you need. If you do want AoE, obviously you put 1 point into Rabies, Enhanced Rabies, and Natural Rabies. Natural Rabies just makes the AoE spread faster, which makes it so that you have poison up on more targets faster, giving you more poison synergy. Lacerate, on the other hand, is really good for single target because it deals a set amount of damage for the entire duration, and if that damage is all on one target, obviously that's more damage instead of being split on a lot of targets. And if you use it in AoE, likely you won't do much. It just slaps every monster a little bit. It's not that amazing. But with Prime Lacerate, gives you a little bit of sustain, and ideally your kicker is Supreme Lacerate, which makes it so that you have a guaranteed crit with the first hit, enabling Brutal Wolf Pack for your wolves to deal more damage, which is also really good for single target. Now, whichever one you pick, after you've put 3 points into their respective abilities, you will go to Call of the Wild and you put 3 points here. Now, you might think like, why would you put points here and not into the actual companions? Well, each point into companions will increase their respective damage by 10%, while Call of the Wild affects all of your companions. So unless the scaling of these abilities change, it's ideal to put points into Call of the Wild first, because it affects both your wolves and your creeper at the same time. And putting 3 points here will give you 30% damage from each skill individually. After this, put 1 more point into Envenom, completely maxing it, and then max Toxic Claws with 2 additional points. You'll only need 1 more point to get to the level 34 bracket, supposedly if you don't have any renowned points, and you'll put that into Predatory Instinct. That will give you more crit with close enemies, which is, pretty self-explanatory. We know why crit is good, and hopefully by this time you already are stacking crit in your gear. And while putting 1 point in Predatory Instinct will unlock your ultimate passive, which is Lupine Ferocity at, supposedly level 35. And Lupine Ferocity makes it so that every 6th werewolf skill hit critical strikes and deals 60% increased damage. Once again, guaranteed crit and more critical strike damage. Crit obviously enables your wolves again. It can apply poison, which enables more damage from everything that you do and more crit damage from everything that you do. After you put a point into Lupine Ferocity, the main part of the build is pretty much done. You normally are 35 here, or a couple of levels lower if you've been farming your renown properly. And after this, it's kind of down to you what you want, but I will give you a list of abilities that I think you should probably max out first in the order that I believe they're more important. But you can definitely change because you might have gear that will move you otherwise into a different direction, or you might have some particular issues with either bosses or AoE. Ideally, you want to put your next 2 points into Predatory Instinct for the max amount of crit chance from your skill tree. Max out Poison Creeper and Wolves afterwards, which would get you to roughly level 45. And after that, put 1 point into Heart of the Wild because it's mostly a prerequisite. You don't really care about maximum spirit, but you do care about wild impulses, which you will max because this increases your shred damage, even though it consumes spirit. But at this point, you probably won't have issues with spirit anymore if you're regularly using your Blood Howl properly and you're using your claws with all of its synergies. Abundance is next for 3 more points, once again because it just gives you more claw spirit generation. And after you put all of these, you're normally level 52, but likely a little bit lower if you've been doing your renown, and you have some optional passives and abilities to put points in depending on which route you took and what exactly you want if you still want to continue as a werewolf. I would recommend you use Ancestral Fortitude and Vigilance at your discretion and put as many points into each one depending on what you need. Because if you went Rabies instead, you might want to put some points into Rabies as well. This is only if you have decent poison damage. And by decent, I mean either from a specific legendary or from actual gear that increases poison damage that you deal or increases damage over time that you do. Either one of these will make Rabies a little bit better, but without that, Rabies is still kind of meh damage, and I wouldn't really recommend putting a lot of points into it. Sure, Ancestral Fortitude and Vigilance doesn't add DPS, but it does add tankiness, which is probably what you'll start to want, especially if you've leveled to 50 and now you're getting into higher world tiers. Another thing that you can get as an optional choice is Digitigrade Gate, which adds movement speed while you're in Werewolf. And lastly, you can put as many points as you have left into Envenom for more slow on your target. You won't have enough points to put into all of these, by the way, so kind of choose what you ideally want. This is pretty much the leveling build. Keep in mind that legendary that drop, or depending on how much renown you get or what you want to do at your Paragon board, these might change, but this is kind of what you're looking for if you want to have the full Werewolf experience with Wolf Buddies, because it actually helps out with Werewolf. Now you also have Spirit Boons, and depending on how quick you get access to these Spirit Boons, likely after level 15, you can choose which ones you want. I will tell you what ideally you would like to get, but it depends on where you put your Druid offerings first. The most important one is Eagle, and you would want to also, once you've unlocked all of the Spirit Boons and all the Boons intentionally, you want to bond with this one so you can get Swooping Attacks and Avian Wrath, because crit, did I mention crit? Crit is pretty crucial. From the Deer you want Wariness, basically some tankiness as well. Snake gives you Masochist, which is pretty self-explanatory for shapeshifting builds. And from Wolf, obviously Pack Leader. Once you get Pack Leader, you'll notice a significant difference in your playstyle. I might even recommend going Wolf first instead of Eagle, since it's probably a little bit more fun. It's a little bit RNG, sure, but it's more fun to pop your companion abilities again and again and again. There's also a point into talking about legendaries or aspects, or both. Now, one crucial thing to understand is that legendaries that drop have their actual effect stronger than normal, and you would ideally want to do that. But obviously when they drop, you'll eventually outscale them, so you'd probably want to extract that aspect and place into another item to kind of continue the process. There are a couple that I would recommend, so you can kind of swap around and see what you get. The first legendary that I recommend you get is probably one of the more accessible ones as well, is Aspect of the Unsatiated, which is very early on in Fractured Peaks in the Tormented Ruins dungeon. What this does is after killing an enemy with Shred, your next Werewolf skill generates more spirit and deals more damage. This is ideally used on Blood Howl, but you cannot always control when you kill stuff with Shred, so you're likely gonna spend most of it on Claw. It's not that great for the damage increase. You're not gonna do a lot of damage with Claw, but you will get a lot of spirit from Blood Howl, since Blood Howl obviously gives you 20 spirit. And with the extra increase in spirit, it obviously scales better with the 20 spirit from Blood Howl than the 10 spirit from Wild Claw. This is probably better if you branch out into other Druid skills that can generate spirit through dealing damage, and a lot more damage that is, but since this is a werewolf focused video and a werewolf focused build, that's usually what you're looking to do. Another really accessible legendary, and actually a very strong one also from Fractured Peaks, is Night Howler's Aspect. I was actually lucky to loot this in an actual legendary and not the actual aspect itself, but you can still get this from the Forbidden City dungeon right north of Menestead in Fractured Peaks. And what this does is make Blood Howl also give you crit and also apply to your companions and allies and stuff for 3 seconds. And since you're going to use Blood Howl and do big shreds and kill a lot of stuff, reset Blood Howl, you'll have a decent amount of uptime for this, especially in AoE fights. Not so much on bosses unless you get into the phase where the bosses spawn essentially more ads. Aspect of the Alpha is something that I haven't actually had the luck of getting, which makes your wolves turn into werewolves that spread rabies. From obvious reasons, this is pretty strong, but not that easy to get. Shepherd's Aspect is something that I did have luck in getting, and this also drops in Blood-Soaked Crag and Dry Steppes. You can make Shred deal more damage based on the numbers of companions you have out, since this works on core skills. On my main Druid, I'm now using it on a Pulverize ability playstyle that I'm working on for Druid, but definitely works amazing for Shred as well. Another thing that's kind of a sleeper legendary is Rapid Aspect. I would strongly recommend that you loot this instead of the actual aspect because it's bonkers. I looted it with a 60% attack speed on my basics abilities, and this is nuts. This is so much spirit, and of course with Claw you'll do so much single target damage, or rather so much single target hits with a lot of spirit generation. Pretty self-explanatory why this is good. So essentially any other legendary that gives you a barrier, specifically the Vigo's Amulet, when you do the storyline it gives you a nice barrier. You have a nice barrier that you can get from the starting town right at the bottom of the map. You get a nice legendary that gives you a barrier whenever you're in combat, which is pretty good. Essentially any legendary that augments your attack speed or your critical strike, that's pretty generic, doesn't have to be Druid related. It's going to work really well. And you're probably going to rotate these around as you level up, depending on your luck, unless you farm them in a dungeon and keep reapplying your aspects to new gear. You can essentially have a lot of options to play with. You cannot have all of them because most of them are on weapons, by the way, but it's definitely fun to play with all of them and it offers some variety in playstyle. This is pretty much the Werewolf. It's actually really fun. It's super mobile. It's really fast. You can do a lot of cool stuff with Werewolf, and it's kind of a sleeper. The more you put points into your abilities and even get gear options that give you extra points to companions, to Werewolf abilities, you'll end up doing quite a bit of damage, and it's really good. The only big weakness that I would recommend you keep in mind of is that this is particularly squishy. I actually hit a wall with my werewolf builds and builds in general around Act 3 where I couldn't kill bosses because they would just do more damage to me than I would do damage to them. So keep that in mind and make sure you get the tankiness passives a little bit quicker if that seems to be an issue. Hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.